Freda! Freda, are you okay? I'm fine.
Sir, the water, it came out of nowhere. Nothing in this house happens by accident. Then who filled that bowl?
Before we rewind 2 weeks, I want to thank everyone who's been rocking with this channel. Your support means more than you know. If you're new here, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter. And comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Now, let's rewind 2 weeks.
There was a saying that travelled quietly through the staffing agencies of Seoul: never take a placement at the Jung estate. Behind its gates, behind the armed guards and the imported marble, lived one of the city's most powerful and most feared crime families. And their only son had made it his personal mission to make sure no outsider ever got close enough to see what the family really protected.
I can't take this anymore. I quit.
That's the 9th one this year. The 9th? Yes, sir, the 9th.
Did you hear what happened to the one before her? She organized his entire closet by color. He rearranged it while she slept and told her she'd lost her mind.
As long as I'm in that house, no maid gets comfortable enough to start asking questions. The agency sent someone new. She's not from here. Send her in.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
9 women before you couldn't last a month.
I don't plan on being the 10th to leave, sir.
The rain over Seoul had a particular way of falling on Gangnam-gu's quiet, gated streets, soft, deliberate, as if even the weather knew better than to make noise near the Jung estate. Behind those iron gates, the household staff moved through their mornings with the careful precision of people walking on glass, because in this house, glass was exactly what everything felt like. One wrong step, one wrong word, and something shattered. Usually it was someone's composure, sometimes it was their livelihood. The morning after the 9th maid packed her single suitcase and walked out through the service entrance without so much as a goodbye to the kitchen staff, the household had the hollowed-out quiet of a place that had lost a fight it didn't know it was having. Mrs. Bach, the head housekeeper, stood in the foyer holding the resignation letter like it might still change its mind if she stared at it long enough. Byun-ho, the household butler, was the one who finally broke the silence, his voice low and clipped as he addressed the staffing agency on the phone in the study. Yes, another one? No, we'll need someone by the end of the week. Someone who... He paused, glancing towards the staircase where Dennis's bedroom door remained shut, curtains drawn against the grey daylight. Someone who can handle the particular demands of this household. What he meant, and what the agency understood without being told, was someone who can survive Dennis Jung. Across the city, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above a shuttered noodle shop, Freda sat at a small kitchen table with a folder of medical documents spread out in front of her like a losing hand of cards. Her younger sister, Amara, was asleep in the next room, worn thin by a heart condition that the doctors kept describing in careful clinical language that all circled the same brutal truth. Without surgery. And soon, she wouldn't see another birthday. The surgery had a number attached to it, a number that made Freda's stomach drop every time she let herself look at it directly. She had already taken 2 jobs, cleaning offices at dawn, waiting tables at night, and the math still didn't work, not even close. She'd heard about the position through a cousin who cleaned houses in the wealthier districts, the kind of whisper that travelled through immigrant communities in Seoul like a current beneath the surface. The Jung house pays triple the standard wage, but no one lasts. Freda had listened to the warning, nodded politely, and written down the agency's number anyway. She didn't have the luxury of being frightened off by rumours. Fear was a currency she couldn't afford to spend. The agency woman who interviewed her, a tired, kind-eyed administrator named Ji-un, had actually reached across the desk at one point and touched Freda's hand, an uncharacteristic gesture of familiarity. "I have to tell you something before you sign anything," she said. "This will be your 10th time sending someone there this year. The boy, the son, he does not want help. He wants a war. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," Freda said, and she did. But she also understood the weight of the folder sitting in her bag, the surgical consult date circled in red ink, the sound of her sister's labored breathing that had become the metronome of her entire life. She understood that some wars were worth walking into with your eyes open. "The pay is triple standard," Ji-un said, almost like a warning wrapped inside a temptation, "because no one stays long enough to collect a second month." "I don't need long," Freda answered. "I need enough." 2 days later, she stood at the base of the Jung estate's gaiters, dressed in the plainest, most respectable clothes she owned, a small case in her hand containing nothing but a change of clothes, a photograph of her sister, and the folder of medical papers she carried everywhere now like a talisman. The gates themselves were an announcement of power, wrought iron twisting into shapes too elegant to be anything but intimidating, flanked by security cameras angled to catch every inch of the approach. Beyond them, the mansion rose in tiers of pale stone and dark glass, a building that looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had decided, grudgingly, to allow people to live inside it. Byung-ho met her at the door himself, which she would later learn was unusual. Normally, new hires were processed by junior staff. But perhaps after 9 failures, the household had learned to take a more personal interest in whoever walked through next. He looked her over with the practiced, unreadable assessment of a man who had seen many people come through these doors and had learned not to bet on any of them. "You know this position has a history," he said, not quite a question. "I've been told," Freda replied. 9 women. Some lasted a week, one lasted 4 hours. He said this evenly, without embellishment, the way a doctor might describe a diagnosis. The young master does not want a maid in this house. He wants to prove that no one is allowed to stay who wasn't born into this family's world. I tell you this not to frighten you away, but because I am tired of watching people walk in here without understanding what they've agreed to." Freda held his gaze. "I understand exactly what I've agreed to. My sister needs surgery she can't get without this salary. I didn't come here for comfort, Mr. Byung-ho. I came here for a paycheck. Whatever your young master throws at me, I promise you, I've survived worse for less." Something shifted behind the butler's eyes, not quite approval, but the beginning of it. He nodded once, sharply, and led her inside. The mansion's interior was a study in cold, curated wealth. Floors of imported stone polished to mirror brightness, walls hung with art that Freda suspected cost more than her entire apartment building. A silence so complete, it felt engineered, like even sound itself had been asked to behave. She was given a small room in the staff wing, Spartan but clean, a single window overlooking a corner of the garden, and a uniform. A dark navy dress with a white collar and cuffs, a crisp apron. She changed into it that first evening and looked at herself in the small mirror bolted to the wall, taking a long breath before she let it go. 10, she thought. I'm the 10th. She didn't yet know that somewhere upstairs, behind a closed door, Dennis Young had already been informed of her arrival and was already deciding, with the particular boredom of a man who had run this same game 9 times before, exactly how he intended to break her. Dennis Young had not asked to inherit a war, but he had been fighting one since childhood all the same. A war for his father's approval, fought on a battlefield where the rules kept changing, and the only constant was that losing meant disappearing entirely from the old man's notice. Min Jun-young ruled his empire the way he ruled his household, through the careful, surgical application of fear, dispensed so precisely that his own son had learned to read the temperature of a room before he'd learned to read. The maids were, in Dennis's mind, a controllable variable in an otherwise uncontrollable existence. Everything else in his life answered to his father: the business, the money, the future that had been mapped out for him since before he could walk. But the household staff answered, at least nominally, to him, and so he had made it his singular project to ensure that no outsider ever got close enough to see the cracks in the foundation of the Jung family, the arguments behind closed doors, the ledgers his father kept separate from the official accounts, the visitors who came late at night and left before dawn. 9 maids had come through those doors in the past year, and 9 maids had left convinced they'd merely encountered a spoiled, cruel young man with too much time and too much money. None of them had understood that his cruelty had a purpose, that every act of intimidation was a wall, built brick by brick, keeping his family's secrets exactly where they belonged. He heard about Freda's arrival from Bayun-ho, delivered with the flat, resigned tone of a man announcing the 10th installment of a story he'd already grown tired of telling. Dennis didn't bother going downstairs to observe her himself. He didn't need to. He already knew how this would go. By the time Freda began her first full day of work, Dennis had a plan already forming. Nothing dramatic, not yet. He preferred to start small. Small cruelties were more efficient anyway. They wore a person down slowly, made them start doubting themselves before they even understood they were being tested. She began in the East Wing, a long corridor of guest rooms that were rarely used but immaculately maintained regardless, because appearances in this house were maintained whether or not anyone was there to see them. Freda worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned, through years of necessity, exactly how to make a room disappear into cleanliness, corners squared, surfaces gleaming, not a single thread out of place. She finished the first guest room in under 40 minutes and moved to the second, unaware that Dennis had slipped in behind her, unaware that he stood in the doorway of the first room, surveying her work with the particular satisfaction of a man about to undo something beautiful simply because he could. He didn't need long. A vase deliberately overturned, a drawer of folded linens dumped and scattered across the floor, mud, real mud, tracked in from the garden specifically for this purpose, pressed into the pale carpet in a wide, careless swath from the doorway to the center of the room. When Freda returned an hour later to do a final check before moving to her next assigned area, she stood in the doorway and took in the wreckage of what had, an hour ago, been spotless. She didn't gasp. She didn't sigh dramatically or mutter under her breath, the way the girl before her, the 9th, the one who'd organized his closet, reportedly had. She simply set down her cleaning cart, rolled her sleeves a fraction higher, and began again. Dennis watched this from a cracked door across the hall, his jaw tight with a frustration he didn't fully understand yet. The reaction he wanted. The flinch. The tears. The muttered curse under her breath that he could report to his father as evidence of her unsuitability. Never came. She simply worked. Methodical, unbothered, as though resetting a ruined room was just another Tuesday. He tried harder the next day. He found her cleaning the west sitting room and made a point of walking past with 2 of his friends, Jae-won and Suho, sons of business associates who treated the Jung estate like their personal playground whenever they visited, and let his voice carry just loud enough for her to hear. "They're getting more creative with who they send us," he said, not looking at her directly, addressing his friends as though she were furniture. "I heard this one's from Africa somewhere. Probably doesn't even know what half these pieces are worth." He gestured vaguely at a porcelain vase on the mantel. An heirloom worth more than most people's yearly salary. "Hope she doesn't break anything trying to dust it." Jae-won laughed, the easy, cruel laugh of a young man who had never once had to worry about a paycheck. "Give her a week. They never last longer than that." Freda continued dusting the bookshelf she was working on, her expression unreadable, her hands steady. She did not turn around. She did not respond. And that, more than any insult he could have thrown at her, seemed to needle Dennis more than he expected. He was used to people flinching when he spoke about them like they weren't in the room. Her stillness felt, somehow, like a door being quietly shut in his face. Nothing to say. He pressed, finally turning to look at her directly. Freda set down her cloth, straightened, and met his eyes for the first time since she'd arrived at the estate. There was no anger in her expression, no fear either. Just a calm, level appraisal, the kind of look a person gives a storm they've already decided not to be afraid of. "I was hired to clean, sir," she said evenly. "Not to entertain conversation. If you'd like the shelf finished before dinner, I should probably get back to it." Something in Jaewon's grin faltered. Suho actually laughed, a short, surprised bark of amusement, quickly swallowed when Dennis shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. Dennis said nothing further. He turned and walked away, his friends trailing after him, and Freda returned to her dusting as though the entire exchange had been nothing more than a passing draft. That night, alone in her small room in the staff wing, Freda allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to feel the exhaustion of the day, the ache in her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw from holding her expression steady all day, the small tremor in her hands that she'd refused to let anyone see. She pulled out the photograph of Amara she kept tucked in the lining of her bag and looked at it for a long moment. Her sister, 12 years old, grinning gap-toothed at the camera in a photo taken before the diagnosis had reshaped both their lives around hospital appointments and financial dread.
I can do this. I can do this.
"I can do this," she said quietly. To no one, to the photograph, to the ache in her chest. "I can do this." She put the photograph away, set her alarm for 5 in the morning, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had decided, fully and finally, that she was not leaving. By the end of her first week, word had begun to travel through the household staff in hushed, disbelieving whispers. The new one hadn't cried. Not once. Mrs. Beck found herself watching Freda with something like curiosity during the morning briefings, trying to detect some crack in the composure, some sign that the girl was simply better at hiding her fear than the others had been. But there was no crack to find. Freda moved through her days with the same steady rhythm, regardless of what waited for her. The overturned rooms, the muttered insults, the small, deliberate humiliations Dennis kept manufacturing with the patience of a man running an experiment he refused to believe was failing. For Dennis, the lack of visible reaction was becoming its own kind of obsession. He had never had to work this hard to break someone. Usually 2 or 3 days sufficed. A well-placed comment about someone's accent, a ruined room timed right before a shift change, a comment to his father exaggerating some minor failing, until the maid in question was let go before she'd even had the chance to properly unpack. But Freda didn't give him anything to work with. She didn't argue. She didn't report him to Byun-ho, though she certainly could have. The butler had made it clear, in his careful, coded way, that if she ever wanted to escalate a complaint, the household had mechanisms for that, however rarely they were used against the young master. She simply absorbed whatever he threw at her and kept working, and it was that absorption, that refusal to give him the satisfaction of a reaction, that began, slowly, to unravel something in Dennis that he hadn't examined closely enough to name. He found himself thinking about her when she wasn't in the room, wondering what it would take, wondering with a flicker of something that felt uncomfortably close to respect before he shoved the feeling down and buried it under irritation instead. How anyone could stay so still under pressure that had crumbled 9 people before her. That irritation followed him into the second week, thickening into something sharper, more desperate. His friends had started to notice too. J1 brought it up over drinks one evening in the estate's private lounge, swirling his glass with the lazy cruelty of someone who found other people's struggles endlessly entertaining. "You're losing your touch," he said, grinning. "The maid thing was supposed to be your specialty." "She's not like the others," Dennis said, more defensively than he intended. "Sounds like you've noticed a lot about her for someone who's supposedly trying to get rid of her," Suho added, and the laughter that followed set something hot and humiliated burning behind Dennis's ribs. He didn't sleep well that night. He kept replaying the moment in the sitting room, the way she'd looked at him. Not with fear, not even with real anger, just with that infuriating, unbothered calm, as if his cruelty was a minor inconvenience standing between her and the next item on her list. It made him feel, for reasons he refused to interrogate, small. And smallness was not a feeling Dennis Jung tolerated well. The following morning, he decided the games needed to escalate. Subtlety, evidently, wasn't working. If ruined rooms and cutting comments weren't enough to break her composure, he would find something that was. The mansion's kitchen was the heart of the household, in a way that even the grand dining hall wasn't. A sprawling, commercial-grade space, fitted with steel counters, hanging racks of copper cookware, walk-in coolers stocked with ingredients flown in from 3 continents. It was, in theory, the domain of the household chef and his small staff, but Dennis had never respected the boundaries of other people's domains, and on this particular morning he found Freda there, finishing the final polish on a row of copper pots before the breakfast service began. She heard him enter but didn't turn immediately, focused on buffing a stubborn water spot from the surface of a saucepan. "Good morning, sir," she said, without looking up, her tone even and professional, the same tone she'd maintained through 2 weeks of his campaign against her. "You've been here 2 weeks," Dennis said, standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "Yes, sir. That's longer than most, so I've been told." He moved further into the kitchen, close enough now that she could feel the shift in the air, the deliberate way he positioned himself to loom rather than simply stand. "You know why, don't you? Why none of them last?" Freda finally set down the pot and turned to face him fully, her expression as calm and unreadable as it had been every day since she'd arrived. "I imagine you could tell me, sir, if you wanted to." "Because this isn't your world," he said, his voice climbing, the frustration of 2 weeks finally cracking through the veneer of controlled cruelty into something rawer, uglier. "You don't belong here. None of you do. You come in from wherever you're from, thinking you can just clean your way into a house like this, into a family like this, like scrubbing a floor makes you one of us. It doesn't. It never will. You're staff. You're replaceable. You're—" "Sir," Freda interrupted, quietly but firmly, "I think you should stop there." The interruption landed like a slap. Dennis stared at her, something wild flaring behind his eyes, the particular fury of a person unaccustomed to being told no, especially by someone he had spent 2 weeks trying to convince himself didn't matter. His hand found the stainless steel mixing bowl sitting on the counter beside him before he'd even fully decided what he meant to do with it. It was still half full of ice water, left over from the morning's food prep. And in one sharp, furious motion, he hurled the contents directly at her. The water hit her full in the face, splashing down over her collar, soaking into the front of her uniform, dripping from her braids in slow, cold rivulets. For a long moment, the kitchen was utterly silent except for the drip of water hitting the tile floor. Freda didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or stumble back. She stood exactly where she had been standing, water running down her neck, soaking into the crisp white apron she'd ironed herself that morning, and she simply looked at him, steady, unblinking, her jaw set, her eyes locked on his with a dignity that made the moment feel, absurdly, like he was the one who had just been humiliated. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice quiet but utterly without a tremor. Dennis's chest was heaving, his hand still gripping the empty bowl, and for the first time since he'd started this campaign, he felt something close to shame flicker beneath the anger, quickly buried, quickly reasserted as contempt, because contempt was easier to hold on to than shame. "Clean this up," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "And clean yourself up. You're dripping all over the floor." "Yes, sir," Freda said. She reached for a kitchen towel, wiped her face with slow, deliberate movements, wrung the excess water from the ends of her braids, and then bent down and began mopping the floor where the water had splashed, exactly as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Dennis stood there a moment longer, waiting. For what, he couldn't have said. Tears, maybe, an outburst, something that would let him feel like he'd won. But she simply worked, calm and unhurried, until the floor was dry and the kitchen was as spotless as it had been before he'd walked in. And then she straightened, met his eyes one final time, and said, "Will there be anything else, sir?" He left without answering. And later that night, alone in his room, staring up at the ceiling, Dennis found himself unable to shake the image of her standing there, soaked and unbothered, staring him down like a woman who had already decided that whatever he did to her, it would never be enough to make her run. It infuriated him more than anything she could have said. The story of the water incident traveled through the household within hours, whispered between the junior staff with a mixture of horror and something that might have been the beginning of admiration. Mrs. Bayek heard about it and said nothing, though she found an excuse to check on Freda personally that evening, offering her an extra set of dry uniforms without being asked. Byonho heard about it too, and though he never confronted Dennis directly, that was not his place, not in this house, something in the set of his shoulders grew a fraction heavier whenever the young master's name came up in conversation after that. Dennis, for his part, told himself that he'd made his point, that whatever had happened in the kitchen was simply the natural conclusion of 2 weeks of testing, and that surely she would submit a resignation letter of her own, joining the growing pile in Byunho's desk drawer. But days passed, and no letter came. Freda continued her work with the same steady rhythm as before, rooms cleaned, linens folded, silver polished, as though the kitchen had never happened at all. It was Jae-won, 3 days later, lounging in the estate's private lounge with a drink in hand and an idea forming behind his eyes that had nothing to do with concern for his friend's well-being, who planted the seed that would change everything. "You keep trying to scare her into leaving," he said, swirling ice in his glass, watching Dennis pace the length of the room with barely contained frustration. "But scaring people only works if they're afraid of something. What is she actually afraid of?" "I don't know," Dennis snapped. "That's the problem. Everyone's afraid of something." Suho put in, reclined across the leather sofa, with the lazy confidence of someone who had never once had to fear consequences for his own actions. "You don't need her to be afraid of you. You need her to be afraid of what happens to her if she stays." Dennis stopped pacing. "What are you saying?" Jae-won leaned forward, his voice dropping into something conspiratorial, almost gleeful. "Your father's paranoid about outsiders for a reason, right? All those ledgers he keeps in the study safe, the real accounts, not the ones the tax office sees. What if she got caught somewhere she shouldn't be? Somewhere with something she shouldn't have access to?" The suggestion hung in the air for a long moment. Even Dennis, who had built an entire personality around cruelty towards the household's domestic staff, felt a flicker of hesitation, a recognition that what Jae-won was describing wasn't a prank, wasn't mud tracked across a carpet or water thrown in a face. It was something with real weight behind it. In his father's world, accusations of corporate espionage weren't handled with a stern lecture and a dismissal. They were handled with the kind of finality that ended in the estate's private security detail escorting someone away and no one ever asking follow-up questions. "That's insane," Dennis said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Is it?" Suho asked. "Or is it the only thing that's actually going to work? You've tried everything else. She's still here. If you want her gone, really gone enough that no one questions it, gone enough that your father stops asking why you can't keep staff for longer than a month, this is how you do it." Dennis paced again, his mind working through the logic even as some quieter part of him recoiled from it. He told himself it wasn't really about hurting her. It was about protecting his family, protecting the secrets that had to stay buried for the syndicate to function, protecting the fragile position he still occupied in his father's esteem despite 9 failed attempts to run off household staff without incident. He told himself a lot of things that night, lying awake long after his friends had gone home, turning the idea over and over until it stopped feeling monstrous and started feeling, in the twisted logic of his own justification, almost reasonable. The following evening, while the household staff finished their duties and the mansion settled into its usual watchful quiet, Dennis let himself into his father's private study using a spare key he'd copied years ago and never told anyone he had. The safe was recessed into the wall behind a framed painting his father had bought at an auction in Zurich, and Dennis knew the combination not because he'd ever been given it, but because he'd watched his father enter it enough times over the years to commit it to memory, without either of them realizing it. Inside sat the true ledgers of the Jung syndicate, encrypted drives containing records of shipments, payments, contacts, and arrangements that, if they fell into the wrong hands, could end careers, end alliances, end lives. Dennis's hand hovered over one of the smaller drives for a long moment, his heart hammering with a fear that had nothing to do with getting caught by his father and everything to do with the creeping understanding that he was about to do something that could not be undone. With an apology. He took it anyway. Later that night, while the staff wing slept, and the only sound in the corridor was the faint hum of the security cameras mounted at each corner, Dennis slipped into Freda's small room, using the master key every family member carried, and tucked the drive deep into the lining of her spare uniform, folded neatly at the bottom of her single dresser drawer. His hands were shaking as he did it. Not from guilt, he told himself, but from the simple mechanical fear of being seen. He left as quietly as he'd come, and did not sleep at all that night, staring at his ceiling and rehearsing, over and over, the story he would tell once the drive was discovered missing. He did not have to wait long.
Someone in this house has taken something that does not belong to them. Something that, if it leaves these walls, endangers every single person standing in this room, myself included. I would like to give whoever did this the opportunity to return it, now, before this becomes something none of us can undo.
The discovery came 2 mornings later, and it came like a detonation. Min Jun-young was a man who checked his private safe with the same religious consistency other men reserved for prayer. Every morning before breakfast, a habit built over decades of running an empire where trust was a currency more dangerous to spend than money. When he opened the safe that Thursday morning and found one of the encrypted drives missing from its designated slot, the household did not simply notice a shift in mood. They felt it, physically, the way people feel a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Within the hour, the estate had been transformed. Security personnel, men who normally stayed unseen at the perimeter of the property, monitoring gates and grounds, were suddenly stationed inside the house itself, at every exit, every stairwell. The household staff were gathered in the main hall, standing in a tense, silent row, while Min-jun paced in front of them, his expression a controlled, terrifying calm that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "Someone in this house," he said, his voice quiet, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water, "has taken something that does not belong to them. Something that, if it leaves these walls, endangers every single person standing in this room, myself included. I would like to give whoever did this the opportunity to return it. Now, before this becomes something none of us can undo." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Freda, standing near the end of the line with the rest of the domestic staff, felt her pulse pounding in her ears. She had no idea, in that moment, that the silence was about to be broken in a way that would upend everything. Dennis stepped forward from where he'd been standing near his father, his expression arranged into a mask of grave concern that he had rehearsed in the mirror that morning until it looked almost convincing. "Father," he said, "I think I might know something." Min-jun turned to face his son fully, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Speak." "I saw her," Dennis pointed, his hand steady despite the roar of his own pulse, directly at Freda, "coming out of the east corridor near your study 2 nights ago. Later than her shift should have had her there. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but given what's happened—" The words landed in the room like a struck match to dry paper. Every head turned toward Freda. Mrs. Bake's face went pale. Byun-ho's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward Freda with something that looked almost like an apology, as though he already knew, in the way that people who have watched power operate for decades come to know things, exactly how this was going to unfold regardless of what she said next. "That's not true," Freda said, her voice steady despite the sudden roaring in her ears. "I have never been in that corridor after my shift ends. I don't even have access to that wing without— Search her room," Min-jun said. And the words fell with the flat, absolute finality of a verdict already decided. It took the security team less than 10 minutes. Freda stood in the main hall, flanked by armed men whose presence alone made the air feel thinner, and listened to the sound of her own belongings being turned over above her. Drawers opened, the small case she'd carried into this house, upended and searched. When one of the guards descended the staircase carrying the drive, held aloft like evidence at a trial that had already reached its verdict, something in Freda's chest went cold and still. "Found in her dresser drawer, sir," the guard said, "wrapped inside a spare uniform." Min-jun's expression did not change, but something in the room's temperature dropped several degrees regardless. He turned to Freda with the terrible, quiet patience of a man who had made peace, long ago, with doing whatever needed to be done to protect what was his. "You understand," he said, "what this means. What you've stolen isn't money. It isn't jewelry. It's information that, if it reaches the wrong hands, gets people killed. My people, my associates, possibly my own family." "I didn't take anything," Freda said, and for the first time since she'd walked through the estate's gates 2 weeks ago, her voice trembled, not from fear of him, but from the sheer disorienting horror of watching a lie assemble itself around her, with such speed and precision that she could barely find the seams to pull apart. "I've never even been near your study. I don't know how that got into my room, but I swear to you, on my sister's life, I did not take it." "Everyone says that," Min-jun replied, and there was something almost tired in the way he said it. The exhaustion of a man who had heard 100 denials in his life and had learned, through hard experience, to disregard every single one of them. He turned to the security detail. "Confine her to the East Wing under guard until I decide how this will be handled. And someone find out how she got access to that corridor in the first place." 2 guards moved towards her, and Freda felt her heart slamming against her ribs, felt the full, terrifying weight of what was happening close in around her. The accusation, the syndicate's particular and merciless definition of justice. The surgery date circled in red ink in a folder now sitting untouched in her confiscated bag, her sister's face swimming up unbidden in her mind. She looked for one brief, unguarded moment toward Dennis, standing beside his father with his arms crossed and his expression schooled into something that might have passed to anyone who didn't know better, as simple concern. But Freda knew better now. She had watched him for 2 weeks, had absorbed every petty cruelty he'd thrown at her, had learned the particular flicker in his eyes when he was performing versus when he meant something. And in the half-second before the guards took her by the arms, she saw it, the smallest, almost imperceptible tightening at the corner of his mouth. Not concern, satisfaction. He had done this. She didn't know how, didn't know why, not yet. But she knew, with a certainty that settled cold and clear beneath the fear flooding through her, that Dennis Young had put that drive in her room himself. As the guards led her toward the east wing, past the staff who stood frozen and silent, unable to intervene, unwilling to become the syndicate's next target simply for speaking up on behalf of a maid who'd lasted 2 weeks longer than any before her, Freda felt something shift inside her. Not despair, though despair would have been the reasonable response to what was happening. Something harder. Something that steadied her spine even as the guard's grip tightened on her arms. She thought of her sister's photograph, tucked in the lining of a bag she could no longer reach. She thought of Ji-Eun's warning at the agency, the tired kindness in her eyes as she'd said, "This will be your 10th time sending someone there." She thought of the water dripping down her collar in the kitchen, and the way she had refused, then, to let them see her break. She was not going to let them break her now either. Whatever was coming, a tribunal, an execution, whatever terrible machinery this family used to dispense its version of justice, she intended to walk into it with her eyes open, exactly as she'd walked through the estate's gates 2 weeks ago. And somewhere, underneath the fear, a small, sharp thought was already taking root. If Dennis Young had done this, he had left evidence behind. He simply didn't know yet that she'd find it. The east wing door closed behind her with a heavy, final sound, and Freda sat down on the edge of the narrow bed in the room they'd confined her to, folded her hands in her lap, and began, very carefully, to think. The room they'd confined her to was smaller than her own quarters in the staff wing, windowless except for a narrow slit near the ceiling that let in a thin blade of grey daylight, furnished with nothing but the bed, a chair, and a guard posted just outside the door, whose shadow she could see shifting beneath the gap. Freda sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time after the door closed, her hands folded in her lap, forcing her breathing to slow through sheer force of will. Panic, she knew, was a luxury. It clouded thinking, and thinking was the only weapon she had left. She replayed the moment in the main hall over and over, Dennis's finger pointing at her, the practiced grief in his voice, and beneath it, that flicker at the corner of his mouth that no one else in the room had been positioned to see. She thought about the 2 weeks she'd spent in this house, every room she'd cleaned, every hallway she'd walked, and a small, cold clarity began to settle over her. Fear like frost forming on glass. She remembered the cameras. Every hallway in the east wing, the same wing where Dennis claimed to have seen her, was fitted with security cameras. She'd noticed them her first week. Small black domes mounted discreetly into the crown moulding. The kind of surveillance a family like the Youngs would install, as a matter of course, watching their own house the way they watched everyone in it. If those cameras had been running the night the drive went missing, then somewhere in this house existed the one thing that could not lie for Dennis Young, footage of exactly who had walked those halls and when. But knowing evidence existed and being able to reach it were two very different problems, and Freda understood, sitting in that narrow room with a guard just beyond the door, that she had perhaps only one chance to make this work. She needed time, she needed access, and above all she needed to survive whatever came next, long enough to use either. It was well past midnight when the door finally opened, and instead of Min Jun-young's cold, controlled fury, it was two of the estate's senior guards who entered, men she recognized from the grounds, older, tired-looking, carrying the particular weariness of people who had seen this exact scenario play out before and took no pleasure in it. The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered man named Officer Han, who had once quietly helped her carry a heavy laundry cart up the service stairs during her first week, closed the door behind them and lowered his voice. "There's a car waiting at the service gate," he said without preamble. "Unmarked. It can have you across the border into safety before sunrise. Money for the journey, new documents once you're clear. This is not an official offer. You understand, this comes from us, not from the house." Freda looked up at him, understanding immediately what was being offered and what it would cost her if she accepted. "You're telling me to run. I'm telling you to survive," Han said, his voice dropping lower still. "You don't know this family the way we do. When Mr. Jung decides someone has crossed him, there is no appeal that changes his mind once it's made. If you stay for whatever's coming, there's a real chance you don't walk out of this house again. We've seen it before. We don't want to see it again, not with you." The offer hung in the small room, heavy and tempting in a way that made Freda's chest ache. It would be so easy. A car in the dark, a new name, a border crossing, and somewhere on the other side of it, safety. The kind of safety she hadn't felt since she'd stepped through those iron gates 2 weeks ago. But underneath the temptation sat a harder truth, one she'd carried with her since the moment the guards led her out of the main hall. If she ran guilty. Forever. Not just in the eyes of Min Jun-young and his syndicate, but in the record of her own life, a stolen drive, a fled maid, a story that would follow her the rest of her days no matter how far she traveled or what name she wore. And somewhere in Seoul, her sister was still lying in a hospital bed, still needing a surgery that a fugitive's wages, earned under a fake name in some other country, would never be enough to pay for. "No," Freda said quietly. Han's brow furrowed. "You don't understand what you're refusing." "I understand exactly what I'm refusing," she said, straightening on the edge of the bed, her voice steadier now than it had been in hours. "You're offering me a way to disappear. I don't want to disappear. I came into this house because I needed the money to save my sister's life, and I am not going to leave it as a woman who ran from a crime she didn't commit. If I run, I lose everything anyway. My name, my future, the surgery, all of it. If I stay and fight, at least there's a chance." She looked up at both men, her jaw set. "I want a trial, a real one, in front of Mr. Jung, in front of whoever needs to be there. I want the chance to prove I didn't do this." The two guards exchanged a long look, the kind of silent communication between men who had worked together long enough to read each other without words. "You understand," the second guard said carefully, "that a formal hearing before Mr. Jung is not like a court of law. There are no guarantees. If he isn't convinced, the outcome could be far worse than exile." "I understand," Freda said. "I want it anyway." Han studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. Not quite admiration, but close to it. The same quiet recognition Byun-ho had shown her weeks ago in the doorway of this very house. "I'll relay the request," he said finally. "Whatever happens after that is out of my hands. But for what it's worth—" He paused at the door, glancing back at her. "In all my years working this house, I've never seen anyone refuse that offer." "Then maybe it's time someone did," Freda replied, and the door closed behind them, leaving her alone again in the dark. But for the first time since the guards had dragged her from the main hall, she felt something steadier than fear settling into her spine. She had bought herself time. Now she needed to use it. She spent the remaining hours before dawn thinking through everything she knew about the house's security systems, drawing on details she'd absorbed almost unconsciously during her 2 weeks of work. The location of camera domes in the corridors she cleaned daily, the small maintenance panel in the East Wing utility closet, where Byun-ho had once shown her the household's backup recording drives during an orientation walkthrough nobody had thought would ever matter. She remembered, with a jolt of something like hope, that as part of her cleaning duties she'd been given a master login for the estate's internal systems, not for security footage itself, but for the routine maintenance checklist app that tracked which rooms had been cleaned and when, an app that, she now recalled with rising urgency, automatically pulled time-stamped stills from the nearest camera feed each time a room was logged as complete, a redundancy measure meant to verify staff diligence rather than catch thieves. It was a small thing, a footnote in a much larger surveillance apparatus. But if the timestamps on her own cleaning logs could be cross-referenced against the footage from the corridor outside the study, it would show, beyond any argument Dennis could construct, exactly where she had been and precisely when. She just needed someone to help her retrieve it. The hearing was set for the following evening, held not in the mansion's formal dining hall as Freda had expected, but in a wood-panelled room on the ground floor that she had never been permitted to enter during her time as a maid, a chamber reserved, she would later learn, for exactly this purpose, disputes within the household that required Min Jun-young's direct judgment. The room had the hushed, ceremonial gravity of a courtroom built by people who trusted no institution but their own. A long table dominated the center of the space, flanked by chairs that filled with the estate's senior staff and several men Freda didn't recognize, associates of the Jung syndicate, she assumed, called in to witness whatever verdict was about to be rendered. Min-jun sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from the same cold stone as always. Dennis sat to his father's right, and Freda noted, with a flicker of grim satisfaction, that he would not quite meet her eyes when the guards brought her in. Byun-ho stood near the wall, his face carefully neutral in the way of a man who had learned to survive in this house by revealing nothing, though his eyes, when they found Freda's, carried something that might have been quiet encouragement. "You've asked for this hearing," Min-jun said, once Freda had been seated across from him, flanked by 2 guards. "State your case." Freda folded her, hands on the table, steadying herself the same way she'd steadied herself through 2 weeks of Dennis's cruelty, by refusing to let her fear show on the surface, even as it churned beneath. "I did not take the drive from your safe, sir," she said. "I have never been in the corridor near your study, not on the night in question, not at any point during my employment here. I believe I can prove it." Dennis shifted in his seat, a small involuntary movement that Freda caught out of the corner of her eye. "There's nothing to prove," he said, his voice pitched to sound bored, dismissive. "I saw her there myself." "Then the footage will confirm what you saw," Freda said, turning to look at him directly for the first time since entering the room. "Won't it?" A flicker of something crossed Dennis's face, too fast for most in the room to catch, but Freda had spent 2 weeks learning to read every micro-expression he had, and she saw the flash of alarm before he smoothed it back into practiced disinterest. Min-jun's sharp eyes moved between them. "Explain," he said to Freda. "As part of my duties, I log every room I clean through the household maintenance system," Freda said, keeping her voice level despite the pounding of her own heart. "Each entry automatically pulls a time-stamped image from the nearest corridor camera to verify the work was completed. I cleaned 3 rooms in the West Wing on the night your drive went missing, not the East Wing, not anywhere near your study. If someone retrieves those logs and cross-references them against the corridor footage from that night, it will show exactly where I was and when. It will also show, she added, her gaze flicking briefly, deliberately, toward Dennis, who was actually in the east corridor that night, if the cameras were recording. The room went very still. Min-jun turned to Byun-ho. Pull the footage. Now. It took nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes during which the room sat in a silence so heavy it felt almost physical. Dennis's leg bouncing beneath the table in a rhythm he seemed unable to control, his father's eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made even the hardened associates in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. When Byun-ho finally returned, he carried a tablet in both hands, his expression carefully composed, though something in the set of his jaw told Freda, before he'd even spoken, that the footage had confirmed exactly what she'd hoped it would. The maintenance logs place Ms. Freda in the West Wing at the time in question, Byun-ho said, setting the tablet on the table and turning it so Min-jun could see the screen directly. 3 separate time-stamped images, corroborated by the corridor cameras in that section. She was nowhere near the study. Min-jun's expression did not change, but something in the air around him did. A tightening, a coldness that seemed to draw the temperature of the entire room down several degrees. And the east corridor camera for that same window. Byun-ho hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. There is footage, sir. Time stamped 11:40 that evening. Show me. The footage that played across the tablet screen was grainy, but unmistakable. The east corridor outside Min-jun's study, dimly lit, empty for several long seconds. And then Dennis Jung, moving quickly and glancing over his shoulder with the particular furtiveness of a man who believed himself unwatched, letting himself into the study with a key he should not have had, emerging minutes later with something small clutched in his hand, tucked quickly into his jacket pocket, before he disappeared down the corridor toward the staff wing. The silence that followed was absolute. Min-jun stared at the screen for a long moment, and then slowly lifted his eyes to his son. Dennis had gone pale, his earlier composure entirely evaporated, his mouth opening and closing without any sound emerging. Father, I can explain. Explain, Min-jun repeated, his voice quiet in a way that was far more frightening than shouting would have been. Explain to me why the footage shows you entering my private study in the middle of the night and removing an item from my safe. Explain to me why that item was later discovered in the room of a woman you accused of stealing it. Explain to me, Dennis, why you were prepared to let me hand down judgment against an innocent person for a crime you committed yourself. Dennis's mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed weakly. It was a mistake. I didn't think. You didn't think, Min-jun said, and for the first time since Freda had entered the room, something like genuine fury crept into his voice, cutting through the controlled calm he'd maintained throughout the hearing. You didn't think about what it means, in my world, to accuse an innocent person of espionage. You didn't think about what would have happened to her if this footage hadn't existed. You didn't think about what it says about the man I am raising to inherit everything I've built, that his solution to a maid he couldn't intimidate was to frame her for a crime punishable by death. Before Dennis could answer, Freda spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension in the room. There's something else, she said, and every head turned toward her. May I speak? Min-jun's eyes settled on her, something unreadable moving behind them. Speak. During my 2 weeks here, I noticed things I wasn't necessarily meant to notice. Freda said carefully, choosing each word with precision. Cleaning staff see more of a house than anyone realizes, which rooms get used at strange hours, who visits when they think no one is watching, whose habits don't match what they claim their habits to be. I don't know the details of your business, sir, and I don't want to. But I do know that on several occasions over the past 2 weeks, I found small electronic devices, the kind used to copy data quickly, tucked behind furniture in the sitting room where your son's friends spend most of their time when they visit. I assumed at first they were simply forgotten charges. I only started to wonder about it after everything that happened yesterday. The room's attention shifted, sharp and immediate, toward Dennis, who looked as blindsided by this revelation as everyone else at the table. "Which friends?" Min-jun said, his voice deceptively soft. Freda held his gaze. "I only know their first names, Jae-won, and another one, Suho, I believe." Min-jun turned to his son. "Is this true? Have you had Jae-won and Suho in the sitting room unsupervised, with access to areas of this house they have no business being in?" "They're my friends," Dennis said, though his voice had lost all its earlier conviction, cracking now under the weight of a realization dawning across his face in real time. The slow, horrifying understanding of a man who has spent months trusting the wrong people entirely. "They wouldn't. Jae-won wouldn't." "Wouldn't what?" Min-jun pressed. "Wouldn't use your obsession with running off household staff as convenient cover for something far more damaging? Wouldn't exploit the fact that every time something went missing, your first instinct would be to blame a maid, rather than examine the friends who spent every evening in this house, drinking your liquor, walking your halls, watching exactly which doors you unlocked and when?" Dennis said nothing. He didn't need to. The color had drained entirely from his face, and Freda watched something break open behind his eyes. Not the petty frustration she'd seen in him for 2 weeks, but something raw, the particular devastation of a man realizing, all at once, that his cruelty had been not just wrong, but strategically useless, weaponized against him by people he'd trusted while the real danger to his family walked freely through rooms he'd never thought to guard. Min-jun ordered a full security review that same night. Every device Freda had described recovered from behind cushions and beneath furniture in the sitting room, each one found to contain fragments of copied data, financial records, shipment manifests, correspondence that, pieced together over what appeared to be months, painted a damning picture of Jae-won systematically harvesting the syndicate's secrets under the cover of casual friendship, using Dennis's paranoid, maid-driven chaos as the perfect distraction to keep suspicion pointed anywhere but at himself. By the time the guards were dispatched to retrieve Jae-won for questioning, he had already fled the city, though Min-jun's associates assured him, with the particular grim confidence of men who had hunted fugitives before, that he would not remain free for long. But that resolution, satisfying as it was to the syndicate's sense of order, did nothing to address the matter still sitting at the center of the table. Dennis Jung, who had stolen from his own father's safe and framed an innocent woman for a crime that carried the weight of a death sentence in this house, simply to satisfy his own wounded pride. Min-jun rose from his chair slowly, and the room seemed to hold its breath collectively, waiting to see what form his judgment would take. He walked the length of the table until he stood directly before his son, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the fury from moments before, only a cold, exhausted disappointment that seemed to land far harder than anger would have. "I have built an empire on the principle that trust, once broken, is not easily repaired," he said. "I have executed men for less than what you did tonight. Do you understand that? A woman nearly died because of your pride. Not metaphorically. Actually died, Dennis. If that footage hadn't existed, if she hadn't had the presence of mind to demand this hearing instead of simply running when the guards offered her the chance, I would have handed down judgment against an innocent person, and it would have been your fault. Entirely your fault." "Father," Dennis started, but Min-jun raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "You will not speak until I have finished." He turned, taking in the room. The assembled staff, the associates, Freda seated at the far end of the table with her spine straight and her expression carefully composed, despite everything she'd just endured. I could exile you. I could strip you of the family name entirely, send you somewhere far from this house where you would have to build a life with nothing, the way so many of the people you've tormented have had to do. Part of me believes that's exactly what you deserve. He paused, letting the words settle, watching his son's face pale further with each one. But exile teaches a man nothing except how to survive alone. What you need to learn, what I have clearly failed to teach you in 24 years, is what it means to work, to serve, to understand in your body, and not just your head, the value of the people you've spent your whole life treating as disposable. He turned to Freda. You have shown more integrity in 2 weeks under my roof than my son has shown in his entire life. You refused to flee when given the chance. You brought evidence rather than accusations. You could have let him face judgment without a word of context about his friends, and instead you gave me the information that likely saved this family from far greater damage than one stolen drive. I owe you an apology I cannot fully give in words, so I will give it instead in action. He looked back at Dennis. From this day forward, until I decide otherwise, you will work under Freda's direct supervision as her assistant. You will perform every duty she assigns you, cleaning, cooking, laundry, whatever her work requires. You will receive no allowance, no use of the family accounts, no vehicles, no privileges beyond a room in the staff wing, and 3 meals a day, the same as any member of this household's domestic staff. You will learn from the woman you tried to destroy exactly what it costs to earn a place in this world rather than simply being born into one. The room was utterly silent. Dennis stared at his father, his mouth working soundlessly, the enormity of the sentence settling over him with visible, crushing weight. Father, please. I'm your son, I can't. You can and you will, Min-jun said, his voice final, unmovable. Or you can leave this house entirely and build a life on your own with nothing, and we will see how long you last without the name you've spent your whole life hiding behind. He turned to Freda one final time. Ms. Freda, your position in this household is secure for as long as you wish to remain, with a salary I intend to double, effective immediately, along with coverage for whatever medical needs your family requires. I understand you came here for your sister. That need will be met in full, regardless of what you decide about my son's supervision. Freda absorbed this for a long moment. The weight of the past 2 weeks, the mud-tracked carpets, the ice water dripping down her collar, the terror of the accusation and the guard's offer to flee, the sleepless calculation that had led her to this room, finally settling into something like relief, though it arrived tangled with an exhaustion so deep it made her hands tremble beneath the table. Thank you, sir, she said quietly. I accept the position, and I accept your son's assignment if that's truly what you intend. Dennis looked at her then, something unreadable crossing his face. Not quite pleading, not quite shame, some third thing that had no easy name, born from the collision of a man's entire self-image cracking apart in a single evening. Freda held his gaze steadily, without malice, without triumph, simply with the same calm she had carried through every ice-water confrontation and mud-tracked carpet of the past 2 weeks. We start at 5 tomorrow morning, she said. I hope you're a fast learner. The first morning of Dennis Jung's new life began before the sun had fully cleared the estate's high walls, in a kitchen he had entered exactly twice before in his life. Once to throw a bowl of ice water at a woman he now had to answer to, and once, years earlier, as a child sneaking sweets from the pantry while the household chef pretended not to notice. Freda handed him an apron without ceremony, the same crisp white style she wore herself, and pointed toward a mountain of copper pots stacked in the deep steel sink. "These need to be scrubbed and polished before breakfast service begins," she said. "There's a proper technique. I'll show you once. After that, you're on your own." Dennis stared at the pots, then at her, some flicker of his old indignation trying and failing to reassert itself. "I've never washed a dish in my life." "I know," Freda said without a trace of sympathy. "That's rather the point." The first week was, by any measure, humiliating. Dennis's hands, soft, uncalloused, unused to labor of any kind, blistered within the first 2 days from scrubbing pots and wringing wet linens. He burned himself twice trying to follow Freda's instructions for a simple breakfast dish, cut his thumb badly enough to need bandaging while attempting to chop vegetables with the speed he'd watched the household chef manage effortlessly for years, and by the end of the first week had developed a permanent, aching soreness in muscles he hadn't known he possessed. Freda offered no coddling and no cruelty either. She simply corrected his mistakes with the same patient, unbothered efficiency she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal he'd put her through, explaining techniques once, expecting him to absorb them, and moving on to the next task, regardless of how badly he'd fumbled the last one. What surprised Dennis most, in those early days, was not the physical difficulty of the work itself, though that was substantial. It was the strange, disorienting experience of being genuinely useful for the first time in his life, of finishing a task and seeing, tangibly, the result of his own effort, rather than the result of money spent or intimidation deployed. There was something almost meditative in the repetition of scrubbing a pot until it gleamed, in folding a stack of linens into perfectly square corners, in watching a room transform under his own 2 hands from disorder into order. He had spent his entire life destroying the order other people created. He had never once experienced the quiet satisfaction of building it. He also began, slowly and against every instinct he'd cultivated over 24 years, to actually see the people around him, not as staff, not as obstacles or entertainment, but as people with lives that extended far beyond the walls of this house. He learned, over shared meals in the staff kitchen that he'd once considered beneath him, that Mrs. Beck had been sending money home to a mother in the countryside for 30 years. That one of the junior maids was studying for university entrance exams in her few hours of free time each week. That Byung-ho had once dreamed of being a chef himself, before family circumstances led him into household management instead. And he learned, gradually, in fragments offered without prompting, during the long hours they spent working side by side, more about Freda herself, her sister's illness, the surgery that had finally been scheduled thanks to the salary increase his father had approved, the small apartment above the noodle shop where she'd grown up making do with less than Dennis had ever imagined a person could survive on. "Why didn't you just leave?" he asked her one evening, weeks into his sentence, as they scrubbed down the kitchen together after a long dinner service. "When the guards offered you the chance to run, you could have disappeared, started over. Somewhere else?" Freda considered the question for a long moment before answering, wringing out a cloth with the same economical efficiency she brought to every task. "Because running doesn't fix anything," she said finally. "It just moves the problem somewhere else, and you carry it with you. I've spent my whole life needing to fix problems, not run from them. My sister's illness isn't something I can outrun. Neither was your accusation. The only way through either one was straight through the middle of it." Dennis absorbed this in silence, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the counter, turning her words over in his mind long after the conversation moved on to other things. It was, he realized slowly, exactly the philosophy his father had spent years trying and failing to instill in him. That real strength wasn't found in intimidating people smaller or more vulnerable than yourself, but in standing your ground against forces far larger, armed with nothing but the truth and the patience to see it through. By the second month, something in Dennis had genuinely begun to shift. He no longer approached his assigned tasks with resentment, but with a growing, almost surprising sense of pride. The pots he polished gleamed brighter than anyone else's. The rooms he cleaned passed Freda's exacting inspection more consistently as the weeks went on. He began waking before his alarm, arriving in the kitchen early simply because he wanted to, because the quiet pre-dawn hours of preparing breakfast had become, unexpectedly, the calmest part of his day. He cut contact entirely with Suho, who had tried, once, to reach out with a half-hearted apology that felt more concerned with his own exposure than any genuine remorse. And Dennis found, to his own surprise, that severing the friendship cost him nothing at all, that the version of himself who had needed Jaewon and Suho's approval to feel powerful had been all along the smallest and least secure version of who he could be. By the time autumn settled over the estate, painting the garden's maple trees in deep reds and golds, Dennis Jung had become, in the quiet estimation of the household staff who had once feared him more than any other person in the house, something close to unrecognizable. He still worked under Freda's supervision, though her instructions had shifted over the months from correcting basic mistakes to entrusting him with genuine responsibility, coordinating supply orders for the kitchen, training the newest household hire on proper protocol with a patience that would have seemed impossible to anyone who'd known him a year earlier, standing beside Freda during difficult moments rather than causing them. His father watched this transformation from a careful distance, saying little, though Freda caught him once, standing in the doorway of the kitchen during a busy dinner service, observing his son coordinate the staff through a complicated menu with quiet, competent authority, an expression on Min Jun's face that might, in a man less guarded, have been called pride. The true test of how far Dennis had come arrived on an evening in late autumn, when a car Freda didn't recognize pulled up to the estate's gates unannounced, and security radioed through that the visitor was requesting to see Dennis directly. Freda watched from the kitchen window as Dennis walked out to meet the car himself, and recognized, with a flicker of tension, Jaewon stepping out onto the gravel drive, thinner than before, clearly having spent the months since his exposure running from consequences that had finally, inevitably, caught up with him, judging by the desperate, pleading posture he adopted the moment Dennis approached. She couldn't hear the conversation from where she stood, but she watched it unfold in gestures. Jaewon's hands raised, imploring, some story or apology or plea for help spilling out of him with visible desperation. And she watched Dennis listen, his posture straight, his expression giving away nothing until, finally, he shook his head, said something short and final, and turned his back, walking away from the car without a single glance behind him. Security escorted Jaewon off the property within minutes. Dennis found Freda still standing at the kitchen window when he came back inside, his jaw tight, something complicated moving behind his eyes. He wanted money, Dennis said before she could ask. Said he was in trouble with people he'd sold. Information, too. Needed help disappearing. Actually had the nerve to remind me of our old friendship, like that meant anything after what he did. He shook his head, something between disgust and disbelief in the gesture. A year ago I would have helped him. Would have thought loyalty meant protecting people like him no matter what they'd done, because that's what my whole life had trained me to believe mattered, keeping the circle closed, protecting my own, whatever the cost to anyone outside it. He looked at Freda directly. I understand now that isn't loyalty. It's just fear wearing a nicer name. Freda studied him for a long moment, seeing, in the steady set of his shoulders and the clarity in his eyes, almost nothing of the man who had hurled a bowl of ice water in her face on her second week in this house. "You did the right thing," she said simply. "I learned it from you," Dennis replied, and there was no performance in the words, no calculation, only a plain, unguarded honesty that would have been unthinkable from him a year earlier. That winter, when the estate hosted its first major gathering of syndicate associates since the scandal of the stolen drive, Min-jun made a point of having Dennis stand beside him throughout the evening, not as the household's disgraced heir kept in the shadows out of necessity, but as a young man who had, through months of genuine labor and hard-won humility, begun to earn back a version of trust that had once seemed permanently forfeited. Freda, moving through the gathering in her role, now expanded to household manager, a promotion Min-jun had insisted on months earlier despite her own quiet protests that she hadn't done anything worth such recognition, caught Dennis's eye across the room at one point during the evening. He offered her a small, genuine nod, not the arrogant, dismissive gesture he might have given a member of the staff a year ago, but the acknowledgement of one person recognizing another's worth, freely given, without hierarchy attached to it. Freda returned the nod and turned back to the evening's preparations, feeling, for the first time since she'd walked through those iron gates months earlier, with nothing but a case and a photograph of her sister, something that resembled peace. Her sister's surgery had been a complete success months before, the medical bills fully covered by the salary Min-jun had promised her that night in the tribunal room, and Amara was, even now, back in school, healthier than she'd been in years, writing Freda long, cheerful letters about ordinary teenage concerns that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. The house that had nearly destroyed Freda in her first 2 weeks had become, against every reasonable expectation, a place where she'd built a life of genuine standing and respect, not because the Jung family's wealth or power had changed who they fundamentally were, but because one man within it had been forced, through hard labor and harder honesty, to finally understand the difference between the power that comes from fear and the far rarer, far more durable kind that comes from earning it. As the estate settled into the quiet hours after the gathering ended, Freda walked the halls one final time before retiring for the night, checking that every room had been properly closed for the evening, the way she'd done every night since her very first week in this house. She passed the kitchen where Dennis had scrubbed his first blistered, humbled pot, the sitting room where he'd once mocked her origins in front of his friends, the corridor where the security footage had, months ago, revealed the truth that saved her life. Every space in this house carried the memory of what had happened within it, and yet none of those memories weighed on her the way they once might have. They had simply become part of the story. The long, difficult, unlikely story of a woman who had refused to run, and a man who had finally learned what it meant to stand still and face the consequences of who he'd been in order to become, slowly and deliberately, someone worth respecting.